Think of one person you let off easy, someone who crossed you, at work, in a relationship, in a negotiation, someone who did something that deserved a consequence, and you chose not to give it to them. You let it go. You told yourself it was the bigger move, the stronger choice, the kind of thing a confident person does. Here's what actually happened. You handed them a map of your limits, and somewhere in the back of their mind, they filed it away. They didn't feel gratitude. They felt relief. And then, a little later, they tested you again, slightly further than before, because they'd already seen where your line was, and you'd already shown them you wouldn't hold it. That person, they're still using that map. Niccolo Machiavelli spent his life watching powerful men fall because of a single error they made over and over again. Not weakness, not stupidity, not bad strategy. They confused the feeling of being merciful with the reality of what mercy actually produces. What he wrote in The Prince was not a guide for monsters. It was a mirror, held up to anyone willing to look at what their compassion was actually costing them. The coldest lesson in that mirror: every time you spare someone who deserved a consequence, you don't end the conflict. You schedule the next one, on their terms, not yours. This video is not going to tell you to be brutal. It's going to show you exactly what mercy does to your position, and what the most dangerous men in history understood about it that almost no one else ever figured out. Pay attention. This one will change how you see every interaction you've had in the last year. Let's start with why this is hard. Mercy feels right. Viscerally, instinctively, it feels like the correct thing to do. You've won. You have the leverage. The person in front of you is vulnerable. And instead of pressing your advantage, you extend grace. You walk away from the kill. You pull your hand back. That feeling, that warmth, that sense of moral superiority is real. The problem is that your opponent doesn't share it. Here is what most people believe: that when you show mercy, the other person feels gratitude, that they recognize your restraint, that they walk away thinking, "This person had me, and they chose not to finish it. I owe them." Sometimes that happens. Rarely, and almost never with people who have the ambition or the ruthlessness to become dangerous. What actually happens, in most cases, is something colder. The person you spared doesn't feel gratitude. They feel relief, and relief, in the psychology of power, very quickly transforms into one of the most dangerous emotions in human interaction: reassurance. You just reassured them that you're manageable. You showed them the ceiling of your aggression. You demonstrated that even when the moment called for decisive action, you hesitated. And the next time they calculate whether to move against you, whether to challenge you, undercut you, betray you, that data point will be sitting in their mental model of who you are. They had me before. They didn't finish it. They won't finish it next time either. Machiavelli understood this with clinical precision. He observed that a prince who is considered too compassionate will be unable to maintain order because small acts of disorder will proliferate. Cruelty used well, early, targeted, resolved, produces less suffering than false mercy that allows problems to compound. The wound you refuse to close becomes an infection. This is the mercy trap. It is not a character flaw. It is a cognitive one. You are confusing the optics of your action with the outcome of your action. You look gracious. You feel gracious. But you have done nothing to change the incentive structure of the person across from you. You have only changed their confidence level, and you have increased it. Think about the last time you held back on enforcing a boundary. Maybe in your workplace, someone consistently underdelivered, and you chose to let it slide one more time. Maybe in a relationship, someone crossed a line, and you absorbed it because the confrontation felt too costly. Maybe in a negotiation, you conceded more than you needed to because you wanted to seem reasonable. How did that work out? Not because those situations required cruelty. They didn't. They required firmness. They required the willingness to make the cost of transgression visible. And when you chose mercy over consequence, you didn't de-escalate the situation. You handed the other person a model of your limits. The psychological mechanism at work is basic operant conditioning. When someone tests a boundary and faces no consequence, they do not conclude that the transgression was acceptable once. They conclude that the transgression is acceptable in general. The unpunished behavior isn't filed as an exception. It becomes a template. A pattern hypothesis they will continue testing until you either enforce the limit or lose the relationship entirely. Mercy, in this sense, is not the end of the conflict. It is the beginning of the next one. Here is where most people misread Machiavelli entirely. They read the word cruelty, and they stop thinking. They assume the argument is, be brutal, be merciless, crush anyone who gets in your way. And then they either recoil from that reading, or worse, embrace it without understanding what it actually means. Machiavelli's argument is far more precise than that. He distinguishes between what he calls cruelty well used and cruelty badly used. This distinction is the entire engine of the lesson, and almost everyone misses it. Cruelty well used is a surgical instrument. It is applied once, completely, at the moment of maximum necessity, and then it is over. The damage is concentrated. The message is absolute. And because it is delivered fully and without hesitation, it does not need to be repeated. The order it creates is durable. Cruelty badly used is something else entirely. It is violence that drips, punishment that is never quite enough, enforcement that comes late, inconsistently, proportioned badly, sometimes too harsh for small offenses, sometimes too soft for serious ones. This kind of cruelty does not create order. It creates fear mixed with contempt. And fear mixed with contempt is one of the most explosive compounds in human psychology. The historical figure Machiavelli uses to illustrate this is Cesare Borgia. Borgia was ruthless, legendarily so. And Machiavelli, writing in the early 16th century, held him up not as a cautionary tale, but as an example of power exercised with intelligence. Here is what Borgia actually did. When he took control of the Romagna region in central Italy, a territory that had been governed badly for years, plagued by feuding nobles and general lawlessness, he appointed a man named Ramiro de Orco to bring order. De Orco was efficient, brutal. He restored control through methods that were harsh and direct, and it worked. The territory stabilized. And then Borgia had De Orco publicly executed. He staged it as theater. De Orco's body was displayed in the town square, split in two, with a bloody knife beside him. The message to the people of Romagna was clear. The cruelty you suffered was not Borgia's cruelty. It came from this man. That man is now gone. Order remains. What Borgia did was not simply violence. It was narrative control. He absorbed the benefit of De Orco's harshness, then separated himself from the cost of it. In a single act, he eliminated a potential rival, appeased the population, and communicated to everyone watching that he, Borgia, controlled the mechanism of punishment itself. This is cruelty well used. It happens once. It resolves something. It sends a message that does not need repeating. Now contrast this with what most people do. Most people who try to project authority do it backwards. They hesitate at the moment when decisiveness is called for. The first offense, the early challenge, the small test, because they want to seem reasonable. They want to be liked. They want to give the benefit of the doubt. And then, after repeated violations, after their patience has been visibly exhausted, they finally act. They overreact. They punish harshly because the accumulated frustration has nowhere else to go. What they have actually communicated across that entire sequence is incoherence. No, they showed that they tolerate violations up to some invisible threshold, and then they snap. No one around them can accurately model what they will or won't accept. The environment becomes unpredictable, not in a way that creates awe, but in a way that creates anxiety and resentment. Machiavelli would call this cruelty badly used. The suffering is distributed badly, the message is unclear, and it will need to be delivered again. The modern application is precise. The first time a boundary is crossed, in a workplace, a relationship, a negotiation, is your moment. Not to destroy anyone, not to perform anger, but to make the consequence clear, proportional, and immediate. One clean action, no extended punishment, no grudge, just a clear signal that you saw the move and you responded to it. That is the lesson, not cruelty as a character trait. Cruelty as a decision, taken once, taken well, then put away. Julius Caesar was the most merciful conqueror Rome had ever seen. He was also stabbed 23 times in the theater of Pompey by men he had personally forgiven. Let that sit for a moment. Caesar had a policy that was, by ancient standards, almost shockingly compassionate. When he defeated his enemies in the civil wars of the late Roman Republic, he did not execute them. He did not exile them. He pardoned them, restored their property, gave them back their political offices, and in many cases actively promoted them. Ancient sources, Cicero, Suetonius, Velleius Paterculus, all document what historians came to call clementia Caesaris, Caesar's clemency as a deliberate, consistent political strategy. His pattern suggests he understood, or at least acted as though he understood, that mercy publicly extended was more valuable than quiet execution, that by forgiving his enemies, he projected the kind of magnanimous power that would transform rivals into subordinates. Among those he forgave, Marcus Brutus, who had sided with Pompey and was on the losing side at the Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar reportedly ordered his officers to spare Brutus specifically, then welcomed him to his camp after the defeat. Gaius Cassius Longinus, who had commanded a Pompeian fleet in Sicilian waters and along the Italian coast, burning part of Caesar's navy before surrendering after Pharsalus. Dozens of senators who had backed Pompey plotted against Caesar and opposed him at every political turn. Caesar looked at these men and saw converts, men who, having witnessed his power and experienced his generosity, would recognize that loyalty to Caesar was the rational position. What he did not understand, what his mercy blinded him to, is that gratitude is not loyalty. Brutus and Cassius did not experience Caesar's forgiveness as a gift that bound them to him. They experienced it as a demonstration of the power imbalance between them. Every time they encountered Caesar's magnanimity, they were reminded of their own subordination. The mercy was not equalizing, it was humiliating. And humiliation, in men of ambition, does not produce gratitude. It produces the need to reclaim dignity. Machiavelli analyzed this problem with surgical clarity. Men forget the loss of their father more quickly than the loss of their inheritance. The wound to status, to the sense of being powerful, autonomous, consequential, is not healed by gifts. It is deepened by them. Brutus and Cassius did not kill Caesar because they hated him. They killed Caesar because they needed to. Not for Rome, not for the Republic. That was the rhetorical frame, and a useful one. They needed to kill him because allowing him to continue to exist, publicly, visibly gracious, undeniably dominant, was an ongoing reminder of their own reduced position in the world he had built. The mercy Caesar showed them did not neutralize their threat. It amplified their motivation. Now look at what happened to Napoleon Bonaparte and the man he could never bring himself to permanently remove. Joseph Fouché was Napoleon's Minister of Police, brilliant, loyal on the surface, and underneath, constantly, quietly, working against the man who employed him. Napoleon discovered this multiple times. In 1810, Napoleon found proof that Fouché had been conducting secret peace negotiations with Britain, behind Napoleon's back, without authorization, actively undermining imperial foreign policy. For any other emperor in history, this was the end. You don't survive betraying Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon dismissed him, and then, 5 years later, during the 100 Days, when Napoleon had returned from exile and needed men, he brought Fouché back. He needed his intelligence network. He needed his political connections. And Fouché was right there, available, willing, seemingly loyal. Fouché proceeded to immediately begin working with Napoleon's enemies again. He helped orchestrate Napoleon's second abdication. He survived. Napoleon didn't. Here is the mechanism that destroyed one of the greatest military minds in history. Tolerance creep. Every time Napoleon extended mercy to Fouché, every time he chose usefulness over consequence, he reset the floor. He taught Fouché that betrayal had a cost he was willing to absorb, that the relationship could survive treachery, that Napoleon's anger had a ceiling, and Fouché had already seen it. What Napoleon experienced as pragmatism, Fouché experienced as permission. The rule: every act of forgiveness becomes the new minimum standard. The person you spared yesterday doesn't feel grateful today. They expect the same treatment tomorrow, and the day after. And when you finally try to hold a line they've already watched you cross, they don't believe you. Why would they? You already showed them the script. They've seen this scene. They know how it ends. Machiavelli called this the danger of incomplete action. Not cruelty, not harshness. The failure to finish what you started. To resolve a threat cleanly, at the moment of maximum clarity, before tolerance became expectation. Napoleon was many things, but he was not ruthless enough with the one man who needed it most. There is a concept in behavioral science called extinction burst. When a behavior has been consistently reinforced, even inconsistently reinforced, and then that reinforcement suddenly stops, the behavior doesn't disappear. It gets more intense, more aggressive, more extreme. Before it dies, it escalates. This is what happens when you show mercy repeatedly and then try to enforce a limit. The person you have been lenient with does not recalibrate when you finally hold the line. They don't think, fair enough, I pushed it too far. They escalate. They push harder, because the pattern they have learned is that pressure eventually produces concession. And the new firmness you're showing reads, to them, not as genuine resolve, but as a temporary increase in resistance before the inevitable give. You trained them to believe this. Every time you extended grace when you should have enforced consequences, you were teaching them that the consequence isn't real. This is the emboldened enemy problem, and it operates at every scale of human interaction. In organizations, it looks like this. A manager repeatedly tolerates chronic underperformance because the conversations are uncomfortable and the employee has a sympathetic story. The team watches. They update their models of what is acceptable. Standards drift. And when the manager eventually attempts to enforce performance standards, months or years later, they meet resistance not just from the underperforming employee, but from a team culture that has already normalized the lower standard. The mercy wasn't private, it was observed, and it sent a message to everyone watching. This is the part that people most consistently fail to account for. Mercy is not a bilateral exchange between you and the person you forgive. It is a public signal to everyone in your environment about your enforcement patterns. Machiavelli was precise about this. He observed that a prince who allows disorders to continue out of compassion will ultimately be forced to act when problems have multiplied, and the resulting harshness will affect far more people than early, targeted action would have. The mercy you extend to one person transfers the cost onto everyone who depends on the order you're failing to maintain. You spared the person who deserved the consequence. Everyone who needed the standard upheld absorbs that cost instead. The military commander who overlooks insubordination spares one soldier and erodes the discipline of 1,000. The executive who doesn't terminate a toxic performer extends grace to one person and drives out 3 good ones who refuse to tolerate the environment. The parent who doesn't enforce limits with a child doesn't save them from discomfort. They transfer the discomfort to every future authority figure that child encounters, unprepared. Mercy at the individual level becomes cruelty at the systemic level. Most people understand this intellectually and still can't act on it, because the individual in front of them is real, visible, sympathetic. The systemic cost is diffuse, delayed, abstract. This is not a moral failing. It is a cognitive one, what psychologists call scope insensitivity. We feel things at the individual scale with enormous intensity. We are almost incapable of feeling systemic consequences with the same weight, even when we can describe them accurately. The powerful person, the one who has truly internalized Machiavelli's lesson, trains themselves to invert this default, to ask not, what does this person in front of me need right now, but what does the system I am responsible for require from me right now? Those are not always the same answer. And the second question is the one that matters. Now we arrive at the most sophisticated layer of the lesson, because Machiavelli does not tell you to be a monster. He is far more strategic than that. What he actually recommends is that a prince should appear merciful, faithful, humane, honest, and religious, while being equipped, when necessity demands, to act contrary to those qualities. This is not hypocrisy. It is the recognition that perception and reality operate on different timelines. The prince who is genuinely, reflexively merciful is predictable. His enemies know his limits. They can operate within those limits safely, accumulating power and position because they have already mapped the ceiling of his response. The prince who appears merciful, but whose mercy is a choice, not a compulsion, is something else entirely. His mercy is not a constraint, it is a message, and messages can be changed. The master case study here is Augustus Caesar. Augustus came to power in the aftermath of the deadliest political period Rome had experienced in generations. His adoptive father, Julius Caesar, had been assassinated by men Caesar had trusted and forgiven. Augustus, then known as Octavian, watched that happen. He processed the lesson at depth. What followed was one of the most methodical power consolidations in ancient history. Octavian did not begin with mercy. The prescriptions of 43 BC, which he co-authorized with Mark Antony and Marcus Lepidus, resulted in the execution of hundreds of political opponents, including Cicero. This was not impulsive. It was targeted elimination of the most dangerous nodes in the opposition network. But by the time Octavian had defeated Antony at Actium in 31 BC and become the unchallenged ruler of Rome, he pivoted completely. He ostentatiously spared his opponents. He refused the title of dictator that Caesar had accepted. He crafted the image of a man who had power and chose not to wield it brutishly. The appearance of mercy became one of the foundational pillars of the Augustan era. Here is what was actually operating beneath that appearance. Augustus's mercy was always conditional and always visible. When he forgave, he did it publicly, in ways that maximized the political value of the forgiveness. He was not processing a feeling. He was publishing a signal. The signal was, Augustus controls the system of punishment and reward. His mercy is evidence of that control, not evidence of its absence. And everyone around him understood, at some level, consciously or not, that what had been given could be taken back. The people he chose to spare lived inside a permanent demonstration of his power. They could not forget it. They did not forget it. This is the appearance engine. Mercy not as a character trait, but as a tool. Applied when it creates maximum benefit, when it converts a potential enemy into a visible showcase of your dominance, when it demonstrates confidence to your broader audience, when the cost of the action you're foregoing is low and the optics of restraint are high. Withheld when the calculation is reversed. The modern professional application of this is precise. In every environment where you have authority, a team, a negotiation, a relationship, you want people to perceive you as fair, reasonable, and humane. Those qualities reduce friction. They make people want to work for you, deal with you, trust you. They are genuinely valuable. The error is when that appearance becomes an identity you cannot violate. When you care so much about being seen as merciful that mercy stops being a choice and becomes a constraint. The moment it becomes a constraint, your opponents have found your ceiling. They know that no matter what they do, the cost they will pay sits below whatever discomfort you have decided you cannot tolerate. You want to be the person who chooses mercy, visibly, in public, when the moment calls for it, and who can also choose not to. That optionality is the source of your authority, not the mercy itself. Here is the single operational truth underneath everything in this video. The goal is not to be harder. It is to be deliberate. Most people think this lesson is about becoming colder, about turning off empathy, about treating people like chess pieces. That is not the lesson. The lesson is simpler and more uncomfortable than that. Automatic mercy is not compassion. It is conflict avoidance wearing compassion's clothes. When you absorb a transgression because the confrontation feels costly. When you let something slide because you want to be liked, because you want to seem reasonable, because you don't want to deal with the emotional weight of the moment. You are not being kind. You are being cowardly. And you are calling it virtue so you don't have to feel that. Real compassion is often hard. It holds people to standards. It enforces consequences not despite caring about someone, but because of it. The parent who enforces limits isn't cruel. They're teaching their child that actions have weight. The leader who removes a toxic performer isn't harsh. They're protecting everyone who depends on the environment that person is degrading. Mercy that costs nothing signals nothing. The operational shift is this. Respond to the first violation. Not with harshness, not with drama. Calmly, clearly, immediately. That is where you have maximum leverage. The relationship is intact, the precedent hasn't calcified, and the cost of holding the line is at its lowest. Most people wait until they're angry. Anger is not a signal that it's time to act. It is a signal that you waited too long. And when you do choose to show mercy, choose it. Make it visible. Make it legible. There is a difference between letting something go because you didn't notice and letting something go because you consciously decided to. The second is power. The first is just a gap in enforcement that your opponent will read as weakness. Machiavelli's lesson was never about cruelty. It was about the refusal to deceive yourself about what your choices actually produce. The person who always forgives has told everyone around them everything they need to know. Don't be that person. Here is the thing nobody tells you. You were not taught to show mercy because mercy makes you powerful. You were taught to show mercy because it makes you easy to manage, easy to predict, easy to manipulate. A person who will always forgive is a person whose limits are already mapped. Everyone around them is already operating inside those limits, pressing a little further each time, testing a little harder, taking a little more. They don't think of it as exploitation. They think of it as reading the room. Caesar forgave Brutus. He forgave Cassius. He forgave dozens of the men who would later surround him with daggers. His mercy was legendary. It was also the last thing he ever produced. Augustus watched that happen. He was 17. He remembered it for the rest of his life. The difference between Caesar and Augustus is not intelligence. Both were extraordinary. The difference is that Augustus understood mercy as a tool, something to be deployed, precisely, at the right moment, for calculated effect. Not a reflex, not a character trait, a weapon used surgically, or not at all. That is the whole lesson. The mercy you show without calculation is not kindness. It is a confession. It tells the world exactly where your limits are and exactly what they can get away with. The mercy you show deliberately, chosen, visible, controlled, is something else entirely. It is a demonstration that you hold the mechanism of consequence itself, that you could have acted and chose not to, that the choice was yours. People don't fear the person who never shows mercy. They fear the person who sometimes does, and they can never quite tell when. Be that person. Think about the person you let off easy. Ask yourself honestly, have they tested you again since? If this video gave you something, subscribe. There's more where this came from.